Okay, so I think we can get started. We're a little bit over the hour, so just wanting to be respectful of everybody's time. And thank you to our panelists for joining, our interpreters, our ASL interpreters, and everybody for joining. So welcome to the first part of our learning webinar series here at Indigenous Climate Action, called the Colonial Urge to Commodify the Climate Crisis. And this one is going to be part one, and it's called Unpacking False Solutions. So we are so pleased to have ASL interpretation through the communities of color operating in allyship. We recognize that ASL is not an option and it is a right, and that disability justice is climate justice. So with that, I think I'm going to hand off to the first of our panelists. My name is Carol Montour. I'll be moderating today. I'm the Climate Leadership Coordinator here at ICA. I'm also Mohawk Wolf Clan from Six Nations of the Grand River, where I'm coming to you live. I think with that, I'll pass off to Sage to introduce yourself.
Okay, so Sego Zaguego and Garaquina Yajets, what's Gardeo and Uganaga Ganagade. As a deal of Gatinu to get us on, then it was 200 across the hand, Gonaxi, Daweston and McGill. So, like, McGill exam season is like upon us. So, yeah, so Sego Zaguego, my name is Garaquineta. I also go by Sage. I'm Bear Clan and I'm from Gahnawaga. I'm also Taos Pueblo and Zuni Pueblo. And I'm a little bit tired today, but I'm also super happy to be a part of the panel. Oh, sorry, I'm talking too fast. That was my bad. And it's exam season at McGill, so I'm a little bit sleepy, but I'm super excited to talk with everyone today. Do I pass it off or?
Yeah, we can maybe pass it off over to Julia. I think there's some people saying they can only see the interpreter. So yeah, we'll just have to be a little bit patient with some of the tech stuff. Is that better? I feel like this is better. Okay, Julia.
Okay. Hi, good morning, afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Julia Bernal. I am from Sandia Pueblo and Yuchi. I'm the Executive Director for Pueblo Action Alliance, and I'm calling in from Sandia, New Mexico. Hope you all are well. Thank you.
And just over to Thomas Joseph.
Hello, my name is Thomas Joseph. I come from the village of Sewalnaldin. I am a Hoopa Valley tribal member located in the Six Rivers National Forest of what's so-called California. I am the carbon pricing educator with the Indigenous Environmental Network, and it is an honor to be amongst friends and family here on the panel. Thank you.
And so thank you again to our panelists. Everybody here has some really great knowledge to share. So I think we're going to get into our first question, which is that we're seeing a lot of these false solutions being pushed forward as the climate crisis worsens. We see a lot of it. It's also being politicized more. And so to each of the panelists, to you, what is your first red flag that a proposed solution is a false one? And I'll probably pass this over to Julia first.
Okay, just to reiterate the question, you're asking like what is a false solution or what do we define as a false solution? Is that correct? Okay. Well, I think for many of us that have been utilizing a grassroots narrative that is around opposition to false solutions or false climate solutions is that they are mechanisms that are placed in the market, thus continues this perpetual cycle of commodification, of exploitation of labor, of extractivism, meaning the creating of surplus of resources to appease the demand of the market. And so when we're applying this definition of false solutions to the climate crisis, we're directly speaking to the blueprint of climate adaptation, climate mitigation that is purely nested in the market. rather than keeping fossil fuels in the ground, rather than returning stewardship back to Indigenous peoples, we are looking at climate world leaders proposing solutions that will continue capitalism, will continue, neoliberalism, transnational corporations. And so we're seeing a lot of ways that these systems are working to continue the fossil fuel industry from going. So, for example, there are a lot of folks that are fighting against carbon capture and sequestration, against hydrogen production, because the production of hydrogen could use fossil fuels, towards geoengineering fixes. So this this movement to invest dollars, energy dollars, into developing and new types of energy infrastructure that are supposed to geoengineer our way out of the crisis. So I think that's like, for some of us, how we would define what a false solution is. And I think that's where it's also been a place where we've positioned ourselves in a very strong stance, where we're saying like no to commodification, no to the financialization of nature, and keeping things in the ground, keeping fossil fuels in the ground. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. And I'll probably pass off to Thomas Joseph now of, yeah, what is to you, what is a false solution? And what's your red flags that something is one?
Thank you. And so when we speak about red flags for false solutions, it makes me reflect upon, like, we need to stay focused on, like, what is the cause of climate change? What has got us into this crisis and this predicament that we find ourselves in? And for me, and we want to recognize the vital role that colonialization has played in creating climate change. And knowing that when we rely on systems of colonialism that is heavily embedded with patriarchy and white supremacy, that these are the precursors to a false solution. And listening to when Vice President at the time, Al Gore, introduced flexible mechanisms into the Kyoto protocols, that was the creation of these market mechanisms, or these systems that can continue to commodify our Mother Earth and put a price tag on carbon, or the sequestration of carbon. We're now seeing the price tag being put on whales, being put on elephants, being put on buffalo. These systems that continue to commodify our Mother Earth are some of the root causes of climate change, and that we can't continue to use these systems of capitalism, of patriarchy, to address the issue, to address climate change. That has what got us into this mess. It's not going to get us out of this mess. And so also on the other side of that, that is what has caused climate change. How do we move out of climate change? How do we create systems that are going to allow Indigenous people to thrive? How are we going to create systems that's going to allow a rebalance of our Mother Earth? Understanding that this reciprocal relationship with our Mother Earth is also brings solutions to our social injustice movements as well. When our planet is out of balance, which we're experiencing right now, we also see how our communities are out of balance when we see women not being paid equal rates, when we see the transgender community being hindered down, being abused, and being neglected. Those things are connected. And so for a red flag for me is when we continue to use those same type of systems that create climate change, and not using systems of Indigenous matriarchy, of creating economies based on the importance of equality. Thank you.
And yeah, I'll probably pass it off to my Mohawk sister, Sage. What to you is a false solution, and what are your red flags that it is one?
Hold on, sorry. Yeah, I don't know how I'm supposed to follow up with those two killer answers. You guys kind of covered everything. But just to kind of go over like red flags that we've seen in our own community of Kahnawake is the fact that they're putting like currency at the forefront of each solution, and they always present like money as a solution to us. Like when we get these deals presented to us with these kind of what they claim to be solutions, they just slap it over with like a number, and they're like, well, we can do this, you can build a culture center with this, you can do all these elements with this, but don't actually discuss the root cause of the situation, like both my relatives here had it discussed. There's so much underlined with this all, like it's embedded in everything. Like every solution that we've looked at so far is just kind of how it contributes or how it makes other people wealthy, as opposed to how do we go back to original ways of knowing and dealing with our, like being the custodians of the land. Like we're, as Ungwehua, as the original people, we're here to take care of the land, and then we're not here to stay. Like we know our relationship is only here for a short while, whereas all these like Western ideologies are trying to put at the forefront of how we can keep going, as opposed to how we can keep our relationship with the land, because we are inherently interconnected with the land, and we follow as Ungwehua the Ahandugarewa Dakwa and Gayanarehgoa, like the words before all else, and our great law principle, and how that interconnects with us. So a lot of the times when we get these solutions, it doesn't follow any of those protocols, and you know, it's not fantastic.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. So I think like what you were all saying made me think of a separate question to ask, of just thinking what Thomas Joseph said of like what caused colonialism, what caused climate change in the first place. And so why do you all, like, why are these being pushed forward? Like we know that climate change is here, it's serious, we know what has caused it, and yet we're not seeing the level of action being taken by industry, by our governments. So that's the question. Why are these solutions being pushed forward? I'll probably pass to Thomas Joseph.
When we see issues like carbon capture and storage, carbon capture utilization and storage, hydrogen, all of these other so-called proposals to climate change moving forward, the underlining factor that these false solutions allow business as usual. We know that the fossil fuel industry is the primary causer, that they have caused the climate crisis. The burning of fossil fuels into the atmosphere is causing our globe to warm, and is starting to cause climate chaos amongst our communities. And so the reasons why we continue using the governments that move towards these false solutions is because it keeps business as usual. If we don't focus on keeping fossil fuels in the ground, if we don't address the root causes of climate change, we are allowing these systems to continue to put our communities in harm's way, and we're allowing these industries to continue to have control and power over humanity. When we know that the global north has played a vital role in the creation of climate change, and making sure that these countries like the United States, the European Union, are continued to reap the benefits of being in a elite status. That's why they want to continue business as usual. That's why they want to continue burning of fossil fuels. Thank you.
Thank you. Sage, what, in your opinion, why are these false solutions being pushed forward?
Oops. Okay. Sorry, can you repeat the question one more time?
Why do you think that these false solutions are being pushed forward?
There's well, we can go reflect back to the first part of that question of being like colonialism caused climate change. Well, with that at contact, we still hadn't had voices at the policymaking table, or still to this day, right? We're still fighting to have a voice. And as Thomas well, Goldtooth had always said, like, if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. So it's prominent that we're there at those tables to discuss these things that affect our communities primarily, because we're the ones that these solutions are affecting primarily, because they use our territories, our waters, our relatives as commodities for their actions, right? And they don't really consult with us. And when they do consult, its consultation doesn't necessarily mean consult, and they always think it does. And there's elements of those that are lacking. But why are they being pushed forward so much? They think they know what they're doing. They're coming from a very, this is kind of a generalization here because it depends, but usually they're coming from a very Western perspective and Western ideologies, and they're not reflecting on Indigenous knowledges or tradition onto what solutions could be. And they can, like, there's a big detachment between those elements. They're so disconnected with the land. Like, as Ungwehue, we are the land. We're the physical manifestation of the land fighting for itself. And to have us separate is inherently colonial, right? So when we're not at those tables discussing what we need to put forward onto these like policy things, then they just walk all over us. And only recently, like under UNDRIP, right, do we get kind of recognition, but still we're not present. Like, we're just loud though, so we just make ourselves known, and that's what we have to do. Like, we've always had to make ourselves known, because if they don't listen, like, they hear us, but they're not listening. And I think that needs to really change before we can, see real difference in having our own solutions be pushed forward.
Yeah, thank you, Sage. And I'll probably pass this off to Julia to ask, why do you think that these false solutions are being pushed forward?
Yeah, I want to return to like the first part of that question that poses like, we know there's a crisis happening, so like, why the inaction? Why are we not going towards mitigation plans that we know that work? And so I believe like the analysis behind that, you have to look at things from a global perspective. Across the world, colonialism as a political agenda has disenfranchised a lot of Indigenous people, just like as, Sage is saying. And that system is to benefit the wealthy and consolidate wealth and power with the rich, and also within nation states like the United States, like Canada, like the UK, all of these colonist countries. They have benefited from global capitalism. And so the inaction around climate is to continue the mechanisms of capitalism, which is exploitation of labor, extraction, the extraction of resources. In order to exploit labor and to extract resources, that also means displacing Indigenous peoples from their homelands. It means rescinding people's human rights to water, to land, to culture, to, essentially perpetuate this like very historical system of colonialism. And because we're at this place where over extraction has, quickly, perpetuated the climate crisis to where like in our lifetime, we're seeing drastic changes. There is a global outcry to keep fossil fuels in the ground, to use solar, to, give land back, to put Indigenous peoples and oppressed peoples in positions of political power to like see change happening. And so when we are faced with plans and ideas that revolve around false solutions, we automatically know that it's nested in a colonial agenda. It's about the continuation of global capitalism and transnational corporations. And so that is like a very simple way of identifying what is a false solution. if it's going to continue commodification, if it's going to continue extractivism, and if it is within a capitalist system, we automatically have to deem that as a false solution.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. I think that's, again, like just like that framework to have of when something comes in, of just looking at it through a specific framework. And so I think that leads me to another question that I'll pose to all the panelists, but I'll ask Thomas Joseph first. What needs to be addressed in order for a solution to not be false? Hold on, I need to reword that. Sorry, just technical difficulties. Yeah, so what are the solutions that need to be pushed forward so that we're not replicating the same systems? Like, what needs to be that framework?
Again, the fossil fuel industry, the burning of fossil fuels is what is causing climate change. That needs to be addressed. We need to be able to reduce emissions at source, not using techno fixes like carbon capture, not expanding the fossil fuel industry into projects like the Willows Project. This is what needs to happen. But in the same time, we need to be able to introduce an indigenous just transition that's going to be able to transform our economies and our communities into something that's not going to continue to replicate the colonial practices that we've been having to endure since settler contact. We need to be able to address the capitalistic system that is continuing to rape and pillage our Mother Earth and push communities of color into harm's way. And so there's an indigenous just transition needs to come forward, which is acknowledging the importance of a matriarchal economy, as also the importance of all of the ills that our society faces when it comes to labor, when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to school. I also feel like a topic that is very, very often neglected in these UN spaces and in these global talks is the role of the imperial war practices. You know, we see talks of war. We hear about war going on right now. We understand that the United States military is the largest producer of fossil fuel emissions, and yet that's always off the table. It's never being talked about on a global network on how to address climate change. And so I feel like that also needs to become part of the conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm also seeing some really great questions come in through the Q&A, but I'll pose this next one, the same question to Julia. What needs to be addressed in order to move forward to address the climate crisis?
Well, I think we have to make sure we're looking at things systemically. There's a lot within like a false solutions narrative and analysis. There's a lot of greenwashing happening. And greenwashing is really a way for to confuse like the consumer, the individual, the civilian, confuse them into thinking that the choices that they're making have an impact on the climate crisis. So like, you know, recycling, going vegan, like these kind of like individualistic solutions are actually perpetuated by oil and gas industry. They're actually like fed by the oil and gas industry. So like the term carbon footprint was actually coming out of oil and gas industry. And so I think like it's important for us to look at the systems that perpetuate climate crisis and the ways that even capitalism is capitalizing off of the crisis. So this is just an economic opportunity in many ways. We're seeing a crisis, therefore there needs to be money invested in technology that can mitigate the climate crisis. That's opening different types of markets and thus is an economic opportunity. So that's like another way on like why our global, you know, grassroots indigenous movement that is against false solutions are repeatedly saying that we cannot have solutions that are within market-based mechanisms, because it's essentially just upholding global capitalism.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. And I'll hand that one off to Sage of what needs to be addressed in order to address the climate crisis meaningfully.
Yeah, I think they really addressed it well, but I mean, it's addressing the root cause of climate change and looking that, like, stop using umbrella ideations for solutions. I feel like that's the main thing. So like, we're diversity and we need to have like diversity, but we need to have place-based needs and solutions to the territories, because like a lot of times it's just umbrella termed. And like Julia had said, like, it's just a way, it's like contributing to capitalism. And she had also brought up a really important point of like, of the individual. And we talked about this in our delegation a hot minute ago of like, when we think of the individual of the I, we've already lost. We need to think of the we and the collective and how we can come together to find a solution. Not one person's just going to make, one person can make a change, but it's better if we all come together and we make those changes together and make those kind of flow with us. And I think it's important because, sorry, I have something in my eye. But when we're thinking about solutions, it's not only, we have to strive away from the Western ideologies, because when we look in those ways, we've already kind of lost in the sense, because as I said before, they're not as connected as we are with the land. And we need to look at Indigenous-led solutions into an Indigenous-led just transition, like Thomas had said and brought up. And then also with that, as an elder youth, I suppose, in this group, we need to like make sure when we're talking about this solutions, we're also dealing with a lot of grief, ecological grief that's associated with this loss, right? Loss and damage. And we need to, when we talk about solutions, I'm sure we're going to get to that question later on, we need to prioritize that. Climate action also pertains to learning your traditional language, learning your songs, learning your culture and your dances and practicing every day. That is climate action. And I think that needs to be really presented to youth, because it can be really hard and heavy when we hear all of these things occurring around the world, and it can be really detrimental. So I think it's really important that we highlight all the really positive elements that our communities are doing. Like for me, Kahnawake, we have Ready Winter Nearnuts, which is an adult Ganigaha immersion program, and it's bringing it back to life, and it's following our traditional ways of knowing and being. And I think that's really important that we highlight this. But yeah, that's it.
Yeah, thank you, Sage. And I think we're going to have a second part of this webinar on uplifting real solutions. So you're just like looking into the future already. But I think we're going to maybe segue a little and ask another question of what are some solutions that are being put forward in your territory that you consider to be false, and how will these impact your community and nation? And I think that we'll pass it off to Julia, because I feel like this happens a lot in your territory. I see this all the time.
Yeah. And I want to try and like address some of these questions in the chat too, because it's really important about some of like these ideas about like, well, what do we do? Like, what are our solutions? Like, how are we going to create energy? How are we going to do it equitably? How are we going to do it without exploitation? And so like a little history about New Mexico, we're a very dense indigenous territory, but we're also very resource rich. And so New Mexico has been historically deemed as a national energy sacrifice zone, meaning that communities, land, water are, essentially sacrificed for energy production in the United States. That means oil and gas, uranium, and now we're even facing hydrogen energy production, and that's something that a lot of us in New Mexico are working on currently. And hydrogen is an interesting example because it is being touted on a global level to be a way to implement the just transition. That this is a stepping stone to phasing out fossil fuels. But with rigorous research and a lot of people keeping their eyes on hydrogen, there are so many ways that you can produce hydrogen. And using fossil fuels, using natural gas, using nuclear, using biomass are all ways that you can, even using solar and wind, are all ways that you can create hydrogen. But this is going to take so much infrastructure. I mean, we're talking about pipeline highways that are going to go across the United States. A lot of the times, hydrogen is coupled with carbon capture and sequestration. So the requipping of existing wells to inject liquid carbon back into the ground. There's just a lot going on with hydrogen, but it's being touted as a clean energy. And while it may burn clean, it doesn't mean that it's produced clean. And so there needs to be a lot of attention and emphasis on the entire fuel chain, from when it's produced, for when it's stored, when it's transported, and like when it gets put into use. But I think one thing I just want to also touch on is that, you know, energy production and tech advances, you know, essentially need to be done in a responsible way, because we're continuing again the system of global capitalism where we're creating surplus, we're overusing finite resources, and we're contributing to the climate crisis. You know, our people, Indigenous people, have used resources, you know, otherwise, like, how else would we exist? But it's done in a way that is responsible and centers stewardship and reciprocity. And so that's a worldview that I think Indigenous people are trying to teach folks across the globe. And talk about like how capitalism is really like this root cause, and colonialism are these root causes for climate crisis. It's not just in a perspective and or opinion. It's the analysis. It's like the root cause for why all of this is happening. As you know, Thomas and Sage and everybody that talks about false solutions really date this problem back to. So yeah, there's, I think that also we have to be in a place where we are providing this type of information to communities, so that way communities can also have the autonomy over what they want their energy grids to look like in the future. If we're perpetuating solutions that are community based, I think a lot of amazing things could happen. But it's when it's like global, transnational, that's where we start to have a lot of problems.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. I'm just fired up listening to everybody talk. And so I'll pass this off to Sage what is a solution that's being pushed forward in your territory that you know of that you consider to be false? Because again, I feel like they're coming more, and they're coming to our communities. So,
well, it's a little bit different for Kahnawake because we're still a federal reserve, right? So the difference between provincial, because Quebec is provincial, and then we're a federal reserve, so it gets a little bit more complicated. And a lot of times corporations kind of go over our heads with the Federal Reserve and just implement it anyways. However, our band system, like the MCK, the Mohawks of Council of Kahnawake, is kind of putting up is looking at these deals more, and then so is KIPO, so Kahnawake Environmental Protection Office is also helping with that. But it's so complicated these days, I have to say, because we have major means of infrastructure that are on our territory. So we have the canal, the St. Lawrence Canal, and then we also have the Seaway, and then we have the bridge, the Mercier Bridge. We have two major highways, the 132 and 138, and then we have the train rails, the trainware. And with these, like, they just kind of implemented them and differently, like federal and provincially, they own different elements. So a lot of times when they kind of present a false solution, they don't really tell us. But one of the means that kind of came to light recently is we have Kahnawake is on, has major different diversity of different ecosystems. Sorry, I'm starting with my words. I'm like thinking ahead and not slowing down. And with that, we have with the wetlands, we have the Wetland Conservation Project or Foundation that came in. And they're kind of like, this one's kind of separate. So there's North Creek, which is also known as Fuggerdas Creek too, where they're like helping a restoration project. And it's kind of low key, but like not necessarily presented that way in association with like offsetting. So it's kind of like, let's restore this area, but then, you know, where's that money coming from? Type of deal. And there's like a lot of those little shady deals going on, but like, you know, we always have to educate more, and I still need to be educated. So if someone from Kahnawake is like, hey, that's not true, like call me out on it and I'll educate myself more, because, you know, we always have to learn and things get miscommunicated a lot of times. But those are some of the things that are being kind of presented in town, but there's, you know.
Yeah, thank you. I also just want to note that I think there might have been some confusion on the time of the starting. Like people were getting suggestions that it started at like 5 p.m. Eastern. So this is recorded and will be live on our social. So if people are coming late or if they missed it, just sorry for the technical difficulties. But I think we'll hand this off lastly to Thomas of, what are some false solutions that are being pushed forward in your territory? Because I do feel like it happens a lot in your homelands.
Thank you, Carol. And this is such a heated question. And I want to start off by saying what Sage was speaking to, like where the money is coming from, right? And so when we look at the Inflation Reduction Act that was recently passed by the Biden administration as a so-called climate bill, we see the allocation of major funding going towards fault solution projects like hydrogen, carbon capture, utilization, and storage, which Julia also spoke to, which is being used for oil enhanced recovery, where they take that captured carbon and pump it into the ground to push more oil up and out. I am enrolled as a Hoopa Valley tribal member, which is located in the Six Rivers National Forest in the northern part of California. I'm also Karuk from that same region, but in the southern part of California is the land of my ancestral peoples on my father's side, which is from Lone Pine, who is experiencing in those lands the threat of massive mining for mineral extraction for these so-called fault solutions, as well as the expansion of a massive highway system, because we still have a desire to all have our personal cars and not create public transit systems. And with these public cars comes the expansion of freeways, the continued mining for precious minerals, including lithium, which we see that is infringing upon the indigenous people's land in northern Nevada when it comes to Thacker Pass. And these projects are being funded by that Inflation Reduction Act, Biden's so-called climate bill. In our region of Northern California, we hear of the desire to go with offshore windmills, which will also create havoc on our fisheries and other wildlife populations in our region. But one of the main concerns that I have is these continuation of these cap and trade and forest offset projects. As a forest dwelling indigenous peoples, we see the targeting of our ancestral territories to use our lands as carbon sinks so that business can continue as usual when it comes to the fossil fuel industry, that the fossil fuel industry can bribe our community members, divide our community members in order to sign these 100-year contracts in order to allow the fossil fuel industry to continue to pollute and put other communities of color into harm's way with less life expectancies, high rates of asthma, high rates of cancer, and all of the other ills that comes with the fossil fuel industry. So this is also a grave concern of mine when it comes to these fault solutions in our region. Understanding that these carbon markets were created to cause division, not just amongst indigenous peoples, but also amongst the environmental movement, where we see other environmental organizations moving forward with supporting these fault solution narratives and supporting these cap and trade carbon market projects. A very deep concern of mine as well is our hydrogen dams that we have in our region. Our tribes in Northern California have recently recently is like suggestive, right? Like after existing for thousands and thousands of years in the same space, you say the last 15 years is recent. Some people will say that's 3 decades, or a decade and a half, sorry, my math. But we have recently came together for the removal of four dams along the Klamath River, which is the world's largest dam removal project. Some of those dams have already came out of place, but understanding that how hydrogen dams are also linked to the carbon market on a global scale, and 80% of carbon offsets on a global scale is coming from hydraulic dams. And so that's concerning to me, knowing that we came together to defeat these dams and get these dams removed, but yet there may be a reason to keep them if they can be used as an offset to allow business as usual for the fossil fuel industry and to claim it as a clean energy. When we know good and well, especially communities coming from salmon regions, that dams are no form of clean energy whatsoever. So that's also very concerning for me as well. But yeah, thank you. There's a lot. It's all concerning. It's dangerous.
Yeah, and this is such a heavy topic, and there's so much ground to cover. And I mean, we could probably have a webinar on this that goes on for all day, right? And we just have an hour and a half today. So thank you again to everyone. And our next question is on false solutions in the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Conference of the Parties, which will be meeting next month in Dubai. So I think I'm going to pose this one to Julia. How, in your opinion, I think everybody here has experienced the UNFCCC, how are false solutions being pushed forward through the United Nations right now?
Yeah, well, there's a lot. Yeah, it's in the energy sector, it's in the agricultural sector, water sector. That's why it's like really important to have like at least a foundation of when you can like identify what a false solution is, because they're constantly changing, right? We respond to the false solution, we lobby against it, we build power against it, and then it evolves into the same mechanism, but like is called something different. So there's a lot of narrative and language wars that this type of work involves itself with. But I think that and this was one of the questions in the chat. I think like one big one that a lot of us mobilized a lot of resources and capacity and power around was net zero pledges. Net zero is, again, another market-based mechanism that will utilize offsetting schemes to seemingly decrease fossil fuels, like what Thomas was sort of talking about earlier. When you achieve net zero, you are not decreasing emissions at the source, but you are trading clean air across the globe. So, we could be polluting here in New Mexico and be offsetting our carbon in a forest in California. And then on paper, you are decreasing your carbon footprint or your carbon emissions, but you're not doing it at the source. And many times, like these cap and trade type of programs, result in even worse conditions for people, for frontline, fence-line communities that are, the ones experiencing environmental injustice. So, we are like pushing for things like a near zero or real zero pledges. How are we phasing out fossil fuels? How are we keeping it in the ground? How are we addressing things systemically? That's just one example in the UNFCCC spaces, but there's many, many more. And like I had mentioned earlier, it's in various sectors. And so we have to constantly just keep educating ourselves on the language that they're using.
Yeah, thank you so much, Julia. And Thomas Joseph, I know that your team at the Indigenous Environmental Network has put a lot of work in the years to bringing awareness through the UNFCCC. So what are, in your opinion, some of the fall solutions being pushed forward by the United Nations?
Oh, geez, so many. Again, some of the major concerns that I have that's being pushed by the UNFCCC pertains to the market mechanisms, pertaining to how we continue to allow communities of color to be sacrifice zones, and how we are the main focus is to allow business as usual. When we look at the previous COPs in Scotland and then in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, we have seen a continual increase of representation from the fossil fuel industry. And even this year, with the COP being in Dubai, how the president of COP is a fossil fuel logo, like he's a giant. He's been in the fossil fuel industry the majority of his life, and he is leading COP28. And so how are we supposed to be able to address the real solutions of climate change when the conversation is held hostage by the fossil fuel industry? And these market mechanisms are their pathway forward to addressing climate change. And these market mechanisms are not only just forest offsets or biodiversity offsets, but we're now seeing how nature-based solutions are going to be commodified. And how agricultural farmers and how the price tag on whales and buffalo are going to be moving forward to address climate change, when really we need to be able to keep fossil fuels in the ground. We need to be able to move forward in a direction that allows us to be able to have a just transition. Now, we even seen them using that language for their benefit. And so now the Indigenous Environmental Network has played a very active role in introducing an Indigenous just transition. And I encourage everybody to look up IENearth.org and find our literature on an Indigenous just transition and how you can implement that in your communities at home. It'll be an exciting day when we're able to limit the influence of the fossil fuel industry into these United Nations spaces. In Germany, this last year, we've seen a step forward in that, where if you are a lobbyist of the fossil fuel industry, you now have to register as a lobbyist, and so that we can identify you. We also know that a lot of the representatives in the parties, for those that don't know, parties are nation representatives in the United Nations space. And so you come in with a party badge. We know a lot of those party delegates are also members of the fossil fuel industry. So we need to push them out of COP. Fossil fuel industry shouldn't have any leg or any stance in dictating the direction of climate change or addressing climate change in COP spaces. We also need to understand that civil society may have to find a different venue, a different way forward. Perhaps COP, the convening of parties, is not the space to resolve climate change. It is failing. COP has, since the Paris Climate Agreement and even before, has not produced any real results in reducing emissions at source. We have seen a continuation of the fossil fuels burning, and not just in industrialized countries, but in non-industrialized countries as well. Coming from the global south, their emissions are also increasing. And when we think about internationally traded mitigation outcomes being attached to the nationally determined contribution of our countries and being allowed to exchange our ability to meet our Paris Climate Accord by using indigenous communities as sacrifice zones for offset projects in the global south, so the global north can continue to burn its emissions, those things need to be addressed. And then we haven't even talked about the importance of recognizing the accountability and responsibility of the countries of the global north to meet the needs of the global south when it comes to climate chaos, when it comes to these countries that are experiencing huge storms and sea rise, and how these nations are being gravely affected by climate change today because of the results of the global north. We owe them. We need to pay restitution for the crimes and for the harm that we have already caused. But you look at the United States, they're trying to neglect those responsibilities. We have a responsibility of burning those fossil fuels and committing to climate chaos. And we need to be held to that account. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas Joseph. I'll pass that off to Sage. Yeah, you have your own experience attending UNFCCC. Yeah, how were some of these being pushed forward by the COP? I think especially from a youth perspective.
I was like, you really want me to answer that? They literally just gave like the perfect answer, but then you switched up the question, so we're good now. But yeah, COP. I don't know, this might be like controversial, but like COP is just a false solution. Like we've seen it, like Thomas just said, like it just hasn't changed. Even when you attend COP, the first year I had gone was to COP26 in Scotland, and I guess where we met Thomas. Hi. And they were already discussing what they were going to do at COP27, and when you're at COP27, they're already discussing what they're going to do at COP28, and it's just like they're missing the entire point. Like it's literally just a way for countries to kind of spend money. I understand the economy growth in it for different areas, but like the earth isn't a business, and they're making it to be a business now, and that's not who we are as Ongwehuma people, right? Like they need to stop doing that. And the UNFCCC is always promoting these false solutions, like specifically carbon pricing and carbon markets. They're trying to like get other countries to buy into it, and then with that they're making it a trading system, an emission trading system, right? And then it's like you're buying into pollution to find a solution, and that doesn't necessarily make sense, right? Like why would you buy into something that's detrimental to the earth? And yeah, I feel like my other panelist homies have already really covered this all, so that's it for me.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. So I think I'm going to also ask something that came up again, and something that people have been asking in the Q&A is about net zero. So I'll pose this. I'll start with Julia. If you could just give like a rundown on what net zero is, and sort of again like how this is being pushed forward, and then yeah, just why net zero is actually zero.
Yeah. So I tried to answer one of the questions in the chat, kind of simply like net zero can only exist like on paper, because net zero is only accomplished through offsetting. And in order to offset, you have to put a price tag on clean air and a price tag on carbon. And so I tried to use like an example of like, okay, say I owned like a farm, maybe it was like an acre big. And the soil on my farm sequesters like X amount of carbon, which is good. That's dynamic process. That's the way the world works, trees, grasslands, soils, healthy soils, all sequester carbon. Oceans, algae, they sequester carbon naturally. It's when you quantify how much carbon is sequestered and then place a dollar price on it. It's very hard to quantify how much carbon is actually sequestered, because it takes there's several different parameters that you have to consider, elevation, climate, the temperature outside even has an impact on how much carbon is sequestered. So those numbers are made up. So then those numbers are then, commodified and create credits. Those credits then can be traded, bought, and sold all over the world. So while my little farm is sequestering, this amount of carbon, Exxon, Shell, BP, whoever could be buying those credits and saying that they are offsetting the carbon that they emit at their, production sites. And that is how on paper they would be able to show that they are inching towards net zero pledges. That doesn't address direct emissions reductions. It's commodifying nature, it's commodifying clean air, and it's a completely made up system, and it's a market opportunity. There's a climate crisis, therefore there's a market opportunity, and that's the way that net zero functions in false solutions, because it's allowing for new markets to open on a global scale, whether they're regulated by the government or not. And that's like why there's such a strong mobilization against net zero, when we could be implementing climate targets that phase out fossil fuels. So you wouldn't even have to count or commodify how much carbon or clean air a certain geography is producing. You would just be decreasing the use of fossil fuels over time. I don't know, Thomas, if you feel like jumping in on the net zero conversation or stage 2, that's I think the best example that I got right now. But yeah.
Yeah, I might pass this off to Thomas. Thank you, Julia. Because there's somebody put in here, is there a way to take back the concept of net zero to bring it back to its original definition? And I think, yeah, obviously Julia hit on that of like, we keep fossil fuels in the ground. But yeah, Thomas, is there a way to take back the concept of net zero to bring it back to its original definition?
Thank you. And Julia did an amazing job in that. So thank you, Julia. For me, net zero is the new climate denier. When you are openly admitting to trying to achieve a net zero target, you don't really believe that we are in a climate chaos. You don't really believe that the solutions to climate change, that we created climate change, and that the fossil fuel industry needs to reduce emissions. For me, net zero, you're a climate denier, basically. What we need is real zero. So recapturing that narrative would be, we need real zero. We don't need a net zero. We don't need a mathematical scheme. When you're cooking the books to prove that you're going to reach net zero by some date of 2030 or 2050 or whatever it may be, when you're cooking those books, you're cooking the planet. So we need real zero, not net zero. Thank you.
Yeah, amazing. And maybe I'll pass to Sage with like a rephrasing of, yeah, how for you, we, as someone working in the climate movement over the last several years, how has your understanding of net zero changed? Because I feel like there's so much marketing toward, especially young people, on this, of net zero being this really positive thing that governments are working toward urgently. So for you, how has your understanding of it changed?
Well, I knew it was duplicious from the beginning, but whatever. But no, they really present it. They really greenwash it. Like I felt like when we were in Scotland, that was like the main thing. They're like, net zero is zero. And we're all like, net zero is not really zero. Like, stop being fake. And and I think Thomas really nailed it down with gotta cook those books, listen up. But yeah, no, I feel like they both, Julia, just like, snaps to you, just present it really well. And I'm just vibing here at this point.
Yeah, everyone is doing amazing. And I think maybe this is I'm seeing another question from Helena in the chat that I'll post to everybody of what an Indigenous alternative to COP would look like. Refusing COP as a false solution, as Sage said, and instead generating another option for climate, land, and waters rooted in Indigenous sovereignty, knowledges, ceremony, etc., like Audra Simpson and Leanne Simpson's work on refusal and generative refusal. So maybe I'll pass that to Julia first of, yeah, what would an Indigenous alternative to COP look like?
Yeah. I've only been to the COP space once. That was a big learning experience for me, just mainly worked on the local and regional level. And so getting into the international work is another dimension of this false solutions work. But I think that, and I know this like happens at the COP also, but There needs to be ability for Indigenous peoples to caucus, to be in space with each other, to talk about our value systems and how Indigenous worldview fits into, you know, the white man's market, this into global capitalism. Because, you know, oftentimes too, like the COP is like the Disneyland for false solutions. I mean, you see like pavilions that are, you know, talking about using nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is clean energy. Hydrogen energy for the future. You know, it's very it gives me like the ick a lot. And so all of that's in your face, and that's where the coercion comes in, because then you're cornering Indigenous populations and coercing them to agreeing to enter agreements that commodify nature, which goes against our value systems. And so if there's an alternative to the COP, it has to be a space that doesn't coerce us into making the wrong decisions or making decisions that could have generational impact. I mean, that's a very meta question. Like, what would be the alternative? And I think a lot of us collectively are starting to think about, you know, what that might possibly look like. But, you know, I'm all about community-based solutions. And so if there's a time and place where we can discuss an alternative space together, then I guess we'll have to have another webinar and tell you all what that answer is.
Thank you, Julia. I'll pass this one off to Sage, because Sage is involved with a collective called Muskrat Collective BIPOC to COP, which brings Black, Indigenous, racialized youth from all over to attend COP. So for you, what would an alternative to COP look like?
Yeah, sorry, I thought I unmuted myself. We actually thought about this law as a delegation, especially my other delegation from Gahnawaga, Yungwaran Tsununstut, which means we mind her the earth. And we thought about this on so many levels, because we realize as youth attending these UN spaces, which is already super cold, right? They neglect a lot of aspects. They neglect youth voices, elder voices, Indigenous voices in general, and there needs to be space for that. And when they come up with these so-called solutions, they're not thinking like with our principles, and that's like Gahni Gohriya, with the good mind, Gasastansre, Ganarunkwa, so like love and strength. And then also the primary one is the 7 generational principle. They don't think 7 generations ahead. They think of the now and how much money we can make right now. And I think that's really neglected. And if we're thinking about like this idea of making like a Unwehue COP, I think it's important that we all come with our traditional knowledge and strength from each nation we come from, and come on a nation to nation relationship and embedded on those terms of a Gahni Gohriya, of that good mind. Because if we neglect that aspect, then we neglect who we are in our relationship to our mother, the earth. And it's really important and prominent that we keep that, because like like the mother, like in our creation story, the earth is the first person to greet us when we come here, and it's the last person to take care of our bodies when we leave here. And it's important that we have that relationship with her. And when we come together and discuss what these solutions should be, that element should really be that core of it, that love that we have for each other, right? And I think if we all came together on different levels of having our youth come together, and then having our like the middle age group come together, and then our elders come together, and we all learn from each other generationally, then we're looking at all 4 fronts. And then we can also connect with our animal relatives too, like not neglecting any aspects of it, because I feel like a lot of the people neglect other nations, you know? So it's really important that we keep on all like these levels all together, and we think about solutions, or quote unquote COP, this hypothetical COP.
Yeah, thank you, Sage. I love how we're all just basically planning our Indigenous COP now. And so I think I'll pass this off to Thomas Joseph. I do want to mention one thing. I think somebody asked in the chat about the resources, and I've posted it to a couple people. If anybody is interested in learning more about false solutions, I recommend checking out Hoodwinked in the Hothouse, which is a resource that the Indigenous Environmental Network and Indigenous Climate Action have been involved with. It's just climatefallsolutions.org. They have a PDF copy. They have a really great audiobook in multiple different languages. So I recommend checking that out for everybody. And yeah, off to Thomas Joseph, because I think a lot of us know, and I don't think anybody of us are banking on the UNFCCC meaningfully addressing the climate crisis. And we also acknowledge that there really is no other space to make high-level interventions except for at the COP right now. So I would love your perspective on what an alternative would look like.
Thank you. And a people's COP, bring it on. That's what we need. We've been hearing this for a while, coming from different delegations and different Indigenous peoples across the globe. We need an alternative to COP. We need a people's COP. And I would love to nominate Sage as its first president, because the information that she just shared and brought forward is the type of information that will be created in a people's COP, where we understand the importance of Indigenous leadership and bringing the ancestral knowledge of our Indigenous peoples to the forefront to have real solutions towards climate change, where we can be able to implement an Indigenous just transition, where there won't be space created to push these false solutions and these narratives to keep colonial powers in power. We have seen recently, just last summer in Africa, there was a form of a people's COP that was created where organizations and Indigenous peoples and communities came together to address an alternative conference to the climate conference that was being presented there in the continent of Africa, where these people came together to address and call out these false solutions and create space where real narratives can come forward to meet climate change. So Sage, first president of the People's COP. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I love that came out of this. Like, we're talking about false solutions, and then we're already like just living in the future. So I am seeing maybe some more questions in the chat, but I think we also just want to have some room for our panelists to share any of their last thoughts on false solutions as a whole. Somebody said to Julia, what were the alternative words you used to net zero? Real zero or near zero. So maybe I'll just pose that to Julia.
Yeah, like real zero, because net is a financial term, you know, like when you're like, let's think about like your bookkeeping, like Thomas was sort of saying, like you have your revenue, but then you have like your discounts on your income or whatever, and that's like your net total. So it's basically the concept of net zero is basically like a discount on emitting carbon. So it's almost like a coupon for emissions, because it's only on paper. It's not actually physically decreasing emissions. And so when we're saying real zero or near zero climate targets, that means like no credit systems, no offsetting schemes, just like phasing out fossil fuels, like phasing out the production of fossil fuels, phasing out the transportation and like the market of fossil fuels. And that's how we're going to reach zero. So the term net is where we have an issue. We need to change that language to near zero or real zero, because that's really the only way we're going to reach climate targets to begin with.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. And that, yeah, I think that's a great point of just like the financial language and just the same mechanisms that have created the conditions of climate change in the first place are now what's being used to attempt to address it. And I think everybody here has a sense of seeing right through that. And I think hopefully people have learned that over our an hour, 15 minutes that we've been going. So just again, thank you to all our panelists. And I think we will just maybe ask, some final thoughts. Just like a go round of everybody on what are anything else that you would like to share about fall solutions? And I'll pass to Sage now.
You always gotta start with me, eh? So much has happened in this conversation. I'm so happy to be a part of it and be a part of you guys too. It's so exciting. But just the best advice I can give, I guess now, just kind of summarizing everything and kind of digesting everything also, is just try to educate as much as possible. Go to ICA's website, go to IAN's website, and go to Pueblo Action Alliance website and go learn. They have like amazing resources, because there's so much to learn, and it can be really like difficult to digest, but just, take in what you can, because we're only here for a short amount of time. So we got to make our footprint, right? We got to help plant those seeds for the next generation and be the change we can be in this lifetime. And I don't know, I'm just really happy to be here. And just remember, like, they couldn't get rid of us the first time. They're not going to get rid of us the second time. We're still here. So let's land back this water back, sky back. And that's it. That's all for me.
Yeah, thank you, Sage. I'll pass over to Julia about any of your just overall last thoughts on fall solutions in this very large topic.
Yeah, I just want to appreciate a comment like of this unlearning. It's so much to unlearn and learn at the same time. And so, a lot of us here have been studying, researching, being in space with each other. I mean, myself, Sage, Thomas, Carol, we're all a part of a cohort where we just like nerd out on false solutions and like, how can we counter narratives that also speak to our community? Or we're on the opposite side where we're having to, code switch into some more academic framing because we're speaking to like the powers that be. And so there's just a lot that I appreciate about, being invited to the conversation today, being in an intergenerational space, because we learn so much from each other, whether that's like the science or the policy or the traditional side of things. So, I encourage folks to, join an organization that is against false solutions, continue going to webinars, community events, reach out. I'm going to put Thomas on the spot. Reach out to Thomas to be in the next cohort for, the next Train the Trainer program. If you're in New Mexico, reach out to us to, help provide material that can, at least attempt to provide some more accessible information, because it's a lot of decoding, and it's a lot of research and time. It takes a lot of time to also be in a space where you feel comfortable talking about the issues. So just want to appreciate everybody's time that they took today to be with us, and the questions that were asked, like, always help us, think about how we're going to like teach the topic to others. So yeah, just want to show some love and gratitude for everybody that attended today. And yeah, thank you, ICA, for inviting us. Appreciate y'all.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I'll pass. Actually, I have two questions for Thomas Joseph, because I see somebody asked if you could share more about how IEN is working to train different folks and how to spread this knowledge, because some of how I learned this was through the carbon pricing training that IEN offered earlier this year. So if you could talk about that, as well as just some of your final thoughts.
Thank you. I want to give a big thank you and shout out to ICA for inviting me into this space, as well as the two cohort members, and Carol as well as a cohort member of our first Ring of Fire cohort that IEN hosted earlier in the summer, late spring, around that time. Also want to thank you for the translators. I appreciate all that you do in making this an equitable space. and also making it sound like or look like we're badasses, because it just looks like that on the screen. So thank you. So the Indigenous Environmental Network offers carbon market pricing training, and you can contact me to sign up for a training project. We try to prioritize Indigenous communities because we understand Indigenous communities are the ones that are being targeted for these carbon offset projects. But we also provide these trainings for allied groups and alliances as well. The Indigenous Environmental Network is also do a train the trainer cohort gatherings where we dive deep into fault solutions to get a greater understanding of the fault solutions that's targeted our own communities and how we need to resist that. As you've seen here, and as we continue to demonstrate the importance of building community against these fault solutions, of continuing to embed ourselves with this knowledge base and this information that continues to always shift. You know, it's a constant learning, but as we build community, we're able to share that learning process. The Pueblo Action Alliance has created a fault solutions coalition that needs to be copied on a global scale, of alliances being formed to stand against these fault solutions that are being introduced into your local communities. And so if you're part of an organization, see how you can structure a no fault solution coalition in your region and in your community to push back against the narrative of these high dollar influences that's not only being funded by the Inflation Reduction Act, but also corporations in the communities that you live in. In closing, there's so much to say when we're talking about fault solutions, but one of the main things that I want to leave everybody with is the importance of the knowledge that you currently hold and the knowledge that you may have learned here today, because with knowledge comes responsibility. When you learn about these issues and you see with your own eyes what's happening to our Mother Earth, how your climate has changed in your region, and knowing that these are the solutions that are being introduced, you are now accountable to that knowledge. You too must strive to push against these false narratives. And the knowledge base, especially if you're an Indigenous person, that you hold, that comes along with you, your lineage of your ancestral wisdom, is what needs to come to the forefront, is the real solutions to address climate change. And that too is also being commodified. That too is also being taken advantage of. But we understand on a personal level what that looks like. And so for yourself to know that you come from a legacy of people that understands the importance of a reciprocal relationship with your Mother Earth, and how that is a real solution to climate change, and how that can also identify what a false solution is. And equally important, if you're not Indigenous, the importance of land back. Understanding that Indigenous peoples hold tenure over 80% of the world's biodiversity, knowing that they have a greater skill and a greater ability to protect our environment and protect our Mother Earth. And so why not give land back? Why not United States was one of the first countries where we witnessed cultural conservancy areas. That's also being pushed as a false solution. We see the 30 by 30 initiative, which is also a false solution. Understanding that if we created these national parks to protect them, but actually what was the result was the removal of Indigenous peoples, well, then we're in a time period and we are in an emergency time that we should be giving those lands back to the Indigenous peoples, that they can care for those biodiversities and stop the mining and the oil recoveries and all of the encroachment that's being done upon them. There's state parks, there's city parks, there's federal parks. This can all be land back opportunities. So thank you. I'll end with that.
Yeah, thank you. And I feel like the land back part is always just like at the heart of a lot of what comes down to when we talk about this work, of just like that importance. I will also highlight another report from the Indigenous Environmental Network and Oil Change International on Indigenous resistance against carbon. If you haven't checked that out, we highly recommend that. We use that a lot in our curriculum, in our climate leadership program, which compiled about a decade's worth of research to show that in the last 10 years, Indigenous frontline resistance to oil and gas has actually reduced greenhouse gas emissions, reduced or delayed greenhouse gas emissions, about 25% of Canada and the US's potential emissions. So when we talk about these things, we are actually referring to like measurable amounts of greenhouse gases that are reduced. And we also, our webinar team has linked the No Fall Solutions resource, as well as Hoodwinked in the Hothouse. So there's so much to be covered on this topic. This is also making me realize that we're probably gonna have to have another one of these in the new year, maybe like a whole series. And I just want to highlight again that we will be having another part 2 of this workshop series, webinar series on the 16th about uplifting real solutions. So we spent, a good chunk of time today delving into fall solutions, and thank you again to our panelists for sharing their knowledge and sharing their time with us. But we also don't want to just pick on like what's not wrong, like what's going wrong. We also want to uplift like what's happening and what's working. And we will have our panelists confirmed again shortly, but we want to uplift those real solutions and that groundwork. And again, thank you to our interpreters through the communities of color operating in allyship. And I think with that, that's it. So thank you. Now we'll go, everybody. We're ending a little bit early, so take some time for your day. Bye.